I had been planning the hike for weeks. The idea was simple: a long solo trek through a section of remote trails I'd never been on before, just to push myself a little, to be away from people, and to see if I could handle a few days in the wild without relying on anyone else. I picked an area that wasn't too far from where I lived, but far enough that cell service would be unreliable and I'd have to be self-sufficient. It was early autumn, the weather still mild in the day but cold enough at night to remind me that summer was gone. The morning I set out, the sky was clear. I had my pack strapped tight, about 35 pounds of gear: tent, sleeping bag, food, water filter, small stove, first aid kit, and the rest of the essentials. I parked my car at a small gravel pull-off near the trailhead, double-checked I'd locked it, and started walking. The air smelled faintly of pine and damp leaves. The first part of the trail was well-marked and easy, with wide dirt paths and gentle inclines. I moved quickly, my legs fresh and my mind focused on the goal of reaching the first planned campsite before dark. I passed a few people during the first couple of hours, all heading back toward the trailhead. After that, the path narrowed and wound deeper into thicker woods. The sound of the road faded until it was just me and the distant calls of birds. My boots crunched through dry leaves and twigs. I liked the isolation at first. Every step made me feel like I was getting further from the world I knew, and I liked the idea of being unreachable for a while. Around midday, I stopped at a small creek to refill my water bottles. I crouched down and worked the filter pump slowly, watching the clear stream flow over smooth rocks. The water was cold enough to numb my fingertips. I ate a quick snack, nuts and dried fruit, before continuing. The trail started to climb more steeply after that, switchbacking up a ridge. I took it slow, not wanting to burn out too early. The higher I got, the more the wind picked up, rustling the branches above. By late afternoon, I was moving through a section where the trees thinned and the ground became rockier. I stopped to check my map and compass, making sure I was still on track. The plan was to camp in a small clearing marked about 2 miles ahead. The sun was dropping lower, and the light filtering through the trees had that dim, golden look that always warns me it's time to start thinking about camp. I reached the clearing just as the shadows were stretching long across the ground. It wasn't a perfect spot. Uneven ground in some places, a few roots sticking up, but there was enough space to pitch my tent and get set for the night. I worked quickly, unrolling my tent, snapping the poles into place and staking it down. Once it was up, I unpacked my small stove and boiled water for a simple meal. It was quiet except for the occasional gust of wind through the trees. That quiet felt heavier than it had earlier. I couldn't see the trail from where I was, and there was no sign of other people nearby. I reminded myself that was the whole point of the trip. I ate, cleaned up, and zipped myself into the tent as the temperature started to drop. Sometime during the night, I woke up. It was pitch black inside the tent. I couldn't tell what had woken me at first. Then I realized I'd heard something outside. A faint crunch of leaves, the sound of something moving in the dark. I lay still, listening. It wasn't steady, more like short bursts of movement followed by silence. My mind ran through possibilities. Deer, raccoon, maybe even a bear. I kept my food sealed in a bear canister several yards from camp, so I wasn't too worried about attracting anything, but I still felt my body tense. The sound faded after a while, and I eventually fell back asleep. When I woke in the morning, there were no signs of anything unusual, no tracks, no disturbed gear. I packed up and started the day's hike. The trail narrowed even more, winding between dense undergrowth. Some sections were barely visible, just a faint track of trampled grass and dirt. I had to stop often to check the map. Around midday, I reached a point where the trail crossed a shallow stream. I stopped to rest, took off my boots to let my feet breathe, and soaked them in the cold water. When I continued, I noticed the terrain starting to change. The hills were steeper, the ground more uneven. Fallen branches and rocks forced me to step carefully. The forest canopy here was thick, letting in only thin shafts of light. It felt darker than it should have for the time of day. That was when I noticed something odd. In the soft dirt of the trail ahead, there were footprints. At first I thought nothing of it. Plenty of people hiked out here, but the more I looked, the stranger it seemed. They were fresh, maybe only a few hours old. They weren't boot prints, though. The edges weren't as sharply defined, and they looked slightly narrower than a typical hiking shoe. The stride was also odd, longer than mine, and the depth of the print suggested someone carrying weight. I kept moving, but now I felt more aware of the forest around me. Every sound seemed sharper. The creak of a branch, the snap of a twig underfoot. After another mile or so, I saw another sign. A broken branch hanging lower than the rest, as if someone had pushed through not long ago. By the time I reached where I'd planned to camp for the second night, I was uneasy. The site was near a small pond, surrounded by tall grass and a few scattered trees. I set up camp and sat by the water for a while, trying to relax, but the feeling of being watched was hard to shake. I kept glancing toward the tree line, half expecting to see movement. That night, I woke again to the sound of something moving. This time it was closer. I stayed completely still, my heart pounding. The steps were slow, deliberate, and they stopped right outside my tent. I could hear breathing, steady, human breathing. I didn't move. My mind raced with what to do. I had a small knife in my pack, but it was buried under gear. After what felt like forever, the sound moved away, fading into the distance. I didn't sleep again. In the morning, I found more footprints near the tent. The size and shape matched the ones I'd seen on the trail. They circled the tent once before heading back into the trees. I packed faster than I ever had in my life and started moving. I decided to cut the trip short and take a side trail that led back toward the main road. It would still be a long day, but I wanted out. I kept checking over my shoulder, scanning the woods. Every now and then I'd catch a glimpse of movement far back along the trail. Too far to make out clearly, but enough to know I wasn't imagining it. By late afternoon, my legs were aching, and I was running low on water. I pushed harder, driven by the thought of reaching safety. The trail widened slightly, and I recognized a landmark from the map that meant I was about 2 miles from the road. That gave me a burst of energy. But the last stretch was the hardest. The feeling of being followed never left. Every few minutes I'd hear a branch snap somewhere behind me. Once, I thought I saw a figure standing still among the trees, watching. I didn't stop to be sure. When I finally reached the road, I didn't stop walking until I was at my car. I threw my pack inside, got in, and locked the doors. My hands were shaking as I started the engine. I didn't see anyone, but I couldn't shake the certainty that whoever had been out there was still in the woods, watching me leave. Even now, weeks later, I keep thinking about the footprints, the breathing outside my tent, the figure in the trees. I tell myself it was just some hiker taking the same route, maybe curious about my camp. But I know how it felt out there. Someone followed me, and they never made a sound when they left. I had been planning the hike for weeks. It wasn't supposed to be anything extreme, just a 2-day trip in a stretch of forest I'd never explored before. The trail was marked on my map, starting from an old logging road that wound into the hills and then cut deep into an area that had no cell service and very little sign of people. That was the appeal for me. I wanted the quiet, the space, the sense of being somewhere where the modern world couldn't touch me. I left my car parked on the gravel pull-off early in the morning. The air was cool and damp, with a thin layer of mist hanging between the trees. I shouldered my pack, double-checked the straps, and started walking. The trail was clear at first, a wide dirt track with scattered pine needles and leaves. The scent of wet earth and pine was strong, and the sound of my boots crunching over small stones was the only real noise besides the occasional bird call. The first hour went smoothly. I kept a steady pace, stopping every so often to sip water and look around. The forest here was dense, but in a peaceful way. Tall trunks rose up in tight clusters, with just enough gaps to see the slopes dropping away on one side and rising sharply on the other. The morning fog slowly burned away, leaving a soft golden light filtering through the branches. Around mid-morning, I reached a fork in the trail. My map showed the main path continuing straight ahead, but there was another trail veering left, narrower and overgrown. It wasn't marked, but the faint line on my map suggested it looped back into the main trail several miles ahead. I figured it might be more scenic, so I took it, the path quickly changed. Instead of firm dirt, it became a mix of mud and tangled roots. The incline increased, forcing me to climb over fallen branches and duck under low limbs. The air felt heavier here, cooler too, as if the sunlight struggled to reach the forest floor. My boots slipped once or twice on the damp ground, but nothing serious. After about an hour on that narrower path, I realized I hadn't seen any signs of people at all. Not even old footprints. That wasn't unusual, but it gave me an odd feeling. I shrugged it off and kept going, making a point to watch for landmarks I could recognize if I needed to backtrack. By midday, I was in deep. The trees pressed in tighter, and the slope on my left dropped sharply into a ravine filled with jagged rocks. The ground was uneven, scattered with loose stones that rolled underfoot. I had to slow down, planting each step carefully. Sweat soaked into my shirt despite the cool air. My thighs burned from the constant climbing and balancing. When I stopped for lunch, I found a mossy boulder and sat with my pack beside me. The forest was quiet, so quiet that the sound of my breathing seemed loud. I ate quickly, wanting to keep moving before I cooled down too much. My plan was to reach a ridge where I could set up camp for the night, but as I packed up, I noticed something odd. To my right, where the trees thinned, there was a faint trail of flattened grass leading into the undergrowth. It wasn't part of the path I was on. At first, I thought it might be a game trail, but it was too straight, almost like a narrow footpath. It wasn't on my map. I stared at it for a moment, debating. Then I decided to stick to my original route. This wasn't the place to start exploring offshoots. I kept moving, but I couldn't shake the image of that hidden trail. It lingered in the back of my mind as the hours passed. The slope on my left eventually leveled out, and the forest floor opened into a small clearing. I checked my map and compass and saw I was still on course, though I'd be cutting it close to reach the ridge before sunset. It was about an hour later when I hit my first real problem. The trail ahead was blocked by a massive fallen tree. It must have come down recently, judging by the fresh splinters and the sharp smell of sap. The trunk was huge, easily 6 feet across, with thick limbs jutting out in all directions. I walked along it, trying to find a way around, but the slope on one side dropped too sharply, and the other was a wall of thorny undergrowth. I had no choice but to climb over it. I hauled myself up, using the rough bark for grip, and swung my leg over. The other side was even trickier, steeper, covered in loose dirt. As I lowered myself down, my foot slipped, and I slid the last few feet, landing hard on my backside. My pack cushioned the fall, but my right ankle twisted sharply. Pain shot up my leg. I sat there for a few seconds, gritting my teeth. The pain eased enough for me to stand, but I could feel a dull ache every time I put weight on that foot. It wasn't bad enough to stop me, but it slowed me down. I told myself I just needed to take it easy and I'd be fine. The sun was sinking lower now, casting long shadows between the trees. The forest had taken on a different feel. Still silent, but heavier somehow, the way it gets before a storm. I pushed on, my ankle protesting more with each step. I was tired, hungry, and still a ways from the ridge. I began scanning for a flat spot to set up camp instead of pushing all the way to my planned destination. I found one about half an hour later, a small clearing sheltered by a ring of tall pines. It wasn't perfect, but it was level and dry. I dropped my pack, stretched my sore legs, and set up my tent. By the time I got a small fire going and boiled water for my meal, the light had almost gone. I ate slowly, listening to the faint rustle of leaves overhead. It was during the night that I woke to a sound. At first, I thought it was part of a dream, something soft, like footsteps on dry leaves. My heart pounded as I lay still, straining to hear. The sound came again, closer this time. It was faint but deliberate. I told myself it could be an animal, but something about the rhythm felt wrong, too slow, too careful. I stayed frozen, listening until the sound faded away. Eventually, I drifted back into a light, uneasy sleep. In the morning, I found something that made my stomach turn. Just beyond the edge of my camp, the ground was disturbed. The leaves and pine needles looked as if they'd been brushed aside, leaving a patch of bare dirt. There were faint impressions there, not clear enough to make out details, but enough to see they weren't made by an animal's paws. They were too flat, too long. My ankle was stiff when I started walking again. The trail wound deeper into the forest, and the air felt cooler. The light seemed dimmer too, even though it was full daylight. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, though I saw no one. Several times, I caught faint sounds behind me. A crack of a twig, the swish of leaves, but each time I stopped, everything went silent. By midday, I reached a stretch of the trail that narrowed to a ledge carved into the side of a hill. The slope dropped away steeply on my left, and the ground underfoot was loose gravel. I moved slowly, testing each step. My ankle throbbed, making it harder to balance. Halfway across, a rock slid under my boot, and I had to grab a tree root to keep from tumbling down the slope. When I finally reached solid ground again, I stopped to catch my breath. That's when I noticed something further down the trail. A shape, half hidden behind a tree. It was still just barely visible between the branches. I stared, trying to tell if it was a person or just a trick of the light. Then it moved. Just a shift, like someone leaning back out of sight. My pulse spiked. I told myself it could have been an animal, but the shape was wrong. Too tall, too upright. I started walking again, faster now, forcing myself not to look back. I didn't want whoever or whatever it was to know I'd seen them. The rest of the day was a blur of pain and tension. Every sound made me tense. I kept glancing over my shoulder, half expecting to see that figure again. I pushed myself harder than I should have, desperate to reach the next marked camping area. But when I got there near dusk, it was empty and unsettlingly quiet. No signs of recent use. No one else around. That night, I didn't sleep much. I kept hearing faint noises outside my tent, sometimes far off, sometimes closer. Once, I thought I saw a shadow move across the thin fabric of the tent wall, but when I looked out with my flashlight, there was nothing there. By morning, I'd made up my mind. I wasn't going to finish the loop. I'd take the shortest route back to my car. My ankle ached with every step, but I forced myself to keep moving. I followed the trail, checking my map often. The forest felt different now, less like a place to explore and more like something I needed to get out of. Hours passed. I barely stopped except to drink water. The noises behind me never completely went away, though they stayed faint, as if whoever was making them knew how to keep their distance. My throat was dry, my legs were sore, and my nerves were frayed. When I finally reached the wider main trail, relief washed over me. I picked up the pace, ignoring the throbbing in my ankle. The sun was low again when I saw the first glimpse of the gravel pull off through the trees. My car was still there, no other vehicles. I reached the car, yanked the door open, and tossed my pack inside. As I slid into the driver's seat, I glanced back at the trail. For just a second, I thought I saw movement in the trees, something pale between the trunks. I had been planning the hike for weeks. It wasn't anything extreme on paper, just a long ridge trail in the mountains, starting at a small parking area and looping around for nearly 15 miles before returning to the same spot. The ridge was supposed to offer long stretches of exposed trail with wide views on both sides, with some dense forest in between. It wasn't the kind of hike that needed special climbing skills, but it was long enough and isolated enough that you had to commit to it. Once you were several miles in, turning around would take just as long as finishing the loop. I chose a day in late autumn, when the leaves were mostly down but the cold wasn't yet dangerous. The forecast showed clear skies, mild wind, and cool temperatures, almost perfect hiking conditions. I packed my backpack the night before, 2 liters of water in a bladder, an extra liter in a bottle, trail mix, energy bars, a light rain jacket just in case, gloves, and my phone with an offline map. I also packed a small headlamp, though I didn't expect to be out past dark. My boots were broken in, and my socks were thick and warm. I arrived at the trailhead just after sunrise. The parking area was empty, which didn't surprise me. This was a long trail, and most casual hikers wouldn't bother with it. I checked the map posted on the signboard and saw a few warning notes about wildlife and seasonal trail conditions. One note mentioned that parts of the ridge could be windy and exposed. and that hikers should be prepared for sudden changes in weather. I noted it but didn't think much of it. The sky was perfectly clear, and the air was still. The first 2 miles wound through dense forest. The trail climbed gradually, covered with a thick layer of leaves. The air smelled of damp earth and old pine needles. Every step crunched softly, and I could hear squirrels rustling in the underbrush. I moved steadily, warming up from the morning chill. The forest was quiet except for the sound of my boots and the occasional bird call. By mile 3, the trees began to thin, and I could see glimpses of the ridge ahead. A long, narrow stretch of rocky ground that seemed to rise and twist toward the horizon. The climb steepened, and I had to use my hands in a few spots to steady myself on rocks. When I finally stepped onto the ridge itself, the world opened up. On my left, the land fell away into a wide valley dotted with bare trees and winding streams. On my right, the slope dropped sharply into a dense patchwork of forest. The trail ran like a thin scar across the top, no wider than a few feet in places. The wind was stronger up here, but still manageable. I walked carefully, watching my footing on the uneven ground. The sun was bright, and for a while it felt almost peaceful. Just me, the wind, and the endless views. I stopped a few times to take sips of water and eat small handfuls of trail mix. About 5 miles in, the ridge narrowed even more. On one side, a steep rocky drop. On the other, a gentler slope but still far from safe. The wind picked up, pushing against me hard enough that I had to lean into it. I kept my steps slow and deliberate. My heart was beating faster, partly from the climb and partly from the awareness that a misstep here wouldn't end well. I noticed the trail ahead dipped into a small saddle between 2 high points of the ridge. The saddle was filled with loose rock and patches of dirt. The wind funneled through it like a tunnel, gusting unpredictably. I crouched slightly as I crossed, feeling the force of the air tug at my jacket. Loose pebbles slid under my boots. At one point, I had to stop and plant my feet firmly until the gust passed. On the far side, the trail climbed again. I made it up slowly, breathing harder now. The ridge widened briefly, and I took that as a chance to rest. I pulled out my phone to check my location on the offline map. The signal was gone, but the GPS still worked. I was exactly where I should be, about a third of the way through the loop. Everything was on schedule. Then I saw something strange. Near a cluster of rocks ahead, there was movement. Not the swaying of grass or the flutter of a bird, but a low, quick shift, like something ducking out of sight. I froze. It was gone before I could tell what it was. I scanned the rocks and the slope beyond them but saw nothing. Maybe it had been a marmot or some other small animal. Still, I felt an odd tightness in my stomach. I pushed on, but my pace slowed. I kept glancing ahead, scanning for movement. The trail curved slightly, hugging the side of the ridge where the drop wasn't as severe. The ground here was looser, with small stones that rolled under my boots. I stepped carefully, keeping my balance. Another hour passed, and the ridge dipped into another saddle. This one was longer and more exposed. I could see dark clouds far to the west, low over the mountains. I remembered the sign about sudden weather changes and felt a flicker of unease. I told myself the clouds were far away and probably moving in another direction. Still, I picked up my pace slightly. It was in the middle of that saddle that I saw it again, movement, but this time closer. Something was crouched near a rock, partly hidden. I stopped cold. It wasn't a small animal. It was a person. They were dressed in dark clothing, hunched low, watching me. For a long moment, neither of us moved. My chest tightened, and I felt my heartbeat in my ears. Then they shifted back behind the rock out of sight. I stood there, unsure what to do. The trail was narrow, and there was no easy way around. Going back meant retracing miles of exposed ridge with a storm possibly moving in. Going forward meant passing that rock and whoever was behind it. I decided to keep walking, but slower, keeping my eyes locked on the spot. My boots crunched loudly in the gravel. When I reached the rock, I glanced behind it. Empty. The slope beyond dropped into a tangle of bushes and boulders. Whoever it was could have slipped down there silently. I stood for a moment, scanning the slope, but saw no movement. Finally, I kept going, my hands tight on my trekking poles. From then on, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. Every gust of wind, every rustle of leaves made me tense. I stopped more often, turning to look behind me, but the trail remained empty. The clouds were closer now, and the wind had a sharper edge. I knew I needed to keep moving to finish the loop before the weather turned. My legs were starting to feel heavy, but adrenaline kept me alert. The next section of the ridge was the narrowest yet, just a few feet wide with sheer drops on both sides. The wind howled here, and I had to crouch slightly to keep my balance. My boots gripped the rock, but every step felt exposed. I didn't dare look down. Halfway across, I heard it, a sound behind me, a boot scraping on rock. I turned my head sharply. Far back on the ridge, just visible between the rocks, was the figure, standing now, facing me, completely still. The distance between us wasn't huge. My mind raced. There was nowhere to go but forward. I turned back and kept moving, faster now but still careful with each step. I didn't look back again until I reached a wider section of trail. They were gone. By now the wind was stronger, and the clouds were over the ridge. A fine mist began to fall, making the rocks slick. I gritted my teeth and pushed on, knowing that slowing down too much would mean being caught in worse weather, and possibly giving whoever was behind me a chance to get closer. The last miles blurred into a steady push forward, my breath ragged, my eyes constantly scanning the ridge and forest edges. When the trail finally dipped back into thick woods, I felt some relief, but not much. The trees closed in around me and the visibility dropped. I heard faint movement in the brush several times. Never close enough to see clearly, but enough to keep my heart pounding. I didn't stop for water. I didn't stop for anything. When I finally saw the trailhead sign ahead, the sky was dark and spitting rain. The parking area was still empty. I hurried to my car, unlocked it, and slid inside, locking the doors immediately. My hands were trembling as I gripped the steering wheel. I never saw the person again. I don't know why they were out there, why they hid, or why they followed me. But I know they did. And I know I was lucky the weather pushed me to keep moving. If I'd hesitated too long on that ridge, I might not have made it back at all. I haven't hiked that trail since. I had planned the hike for months. The trail I picked wasn't one of those tourist spots where you could buy a coffee at the parking lot and still be in cell range the whole time. This was deeper, a less maintained section of a national forest far from towns or highways. I'd done smaller solo hikes before, but this one would push me into territory I'd never been in, both in distance and in remoteness. My plan was to start early, take a full day to get to a camping spot near a small lake, spend the night, and hike back the next day. The morning I started, the sky was pale gray, the kind that promises it'll either clear up beautifully or drape everything in drizzle by afternoon. The air was damp and cool, and the trail started wide, with packed dirt under my boots. My backpack felt heavier than it should have. A combination of too much water, an extra layer of clothes, and the constant thought in my head that I might need something later. I had read stories of people who didn't pack enough and regretted it. I wasn't going to be one of them. The first few miles went smoothly. The trail was marked well at the start, with faded signs nailed to posts and trees, though I noticed the paint on some was peeling and moss-covered. Birds made the only real noise besides my own boots crunching dirt and leaves. The smell of damp earth mixed with pine sap was strong, and I liked it. The forest here was dense, but not the kind that made you feel boxed in. More like a huge cathedral of trees, their tops swaying in the breeze. By mile 6, I started seeing fewer signs. The trail narrowed, and roots started to twist up through the dirt like bones under skin. In some places, water from an earlier rain had turned the path into mud, forcing me to step carefully on the edges to keep from sinking ankle deep. My pace slowed, and I checked my watch more often. I knew I still had hours before reaching the lake, but I couldn't shake the feeling that the trail was becoming less certain. Then I reached the first down tree. It wasn't huge, but it blocked the path completely, forcing me to climb over. My boots slipped a little on the wet bark. Once over, I kept going, but now I was alert in a way I hadn't been before. A fallen tree meant storms, storms meant erosion, and erosion meant parts of the trail could be washed out. The slope started increasing after that. The forest got quieter too. Fewer birds, more of the hollow sound of wind pushing through higher branches. I stopped once to drink from my water bottle and realized I hadn't seen another hiker all morning. That was part of why I picked this trail. I wanted solitude, but now that solitude had weight to it. There was no backup here. No chance someone would just stroll by if I twisted an ankle. The trail took me along a ridge for a while, where I could see the valley dropping away on my right. That's when the first sign of trouble hit. In one steep section, the dirt had collapsed in a small landslide, leaving a gap where the trail should have been. It wasn't wide, but it was slick. I dug my boots into the slope above it and used my trekking pole to steady myself as I stepped across. My left foot slid a few inches before catching. I felt my heart hammer in my chest. Once past, I tried to shake it off, but my legs stayed tight. My breathing sounded too loud in my own ears. I told myself that this was just part of hiking in wilder areas. You deal with it and keep moving. The trail dropped again into a lower section where the trees grew closer together. The ground was spongy with layers of fallen needles. In the dim light here, I had to keep my eyes low to watch for roots. At one point, I heard a crack of branches somewhere behind me. I froze, turning slowly, scanning the trees. Nothing moved. I stood there longer than I should have, listening for another sound, but all I got was silence. Eventually, I forced myself to move on, though every step felt heavier. By the time I reached the halfway point, I could feel the burn in my legs. My shoulders ached from the straps of my pack. I checked my watch again, later than I wanted. I should have been covering more ground by now. I pulled out my map, crouching to rest my knees, and traced the line of the trail with my finger. According to the paper, I was still on track, but paper maps don't show the weight of the terrain. The lake was still hours away. I pushed on. The slope steepened again, and I came to another section where the trail was barely visible. Fallen leaves and debris had covered it so much that I had to stop and scan for the faint depression in the ground that marked where people had walked before. My trekking pole tapped the ground ahead of me, feeling for soft spots. And then I heard it again, that crack, sharper this time, like a foot on a branch. My head turned so fast my neck tensed. The forest behind me looked the same, but I felt something change in the air, like the space was no longer empty. I stayed still, eyes flicking between the trees, my ears straining for even the smallest sound. Nothing. I told myself it could have been a deer, maybe even a branch falling from wind. Still, I couldn't stop the adrenaline creeping into my arms. I started walking again, a little faster now. When the trail finally opened up slightly, I realized I'd entered a stretch that hadn't seen much maintenance. Ferns grew over the edges, and small saplings sprouted right in the middle of the path. I had to push them aside as I moved. The ground here was uneven and pitted, as if animals had dug at it. The sound came again, closer. This time it wasn't just a snap, but the rustle of something moving through brush. My body reacted before my mind. I picked up my pace to almost a jog, my boots catching on roots, my breath coming hard. I didn't look back. When I finally slowed, my chest hurt from breathing so fast. I stopped, bent over, listening again. The forest behind me was quiet, too quiet. I kept scanning the trees, half expecting to see movement, but nothing came. I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't making it to the lake. I made the decision to turn back, but when I checked my map, something cold settled in my stomach. The ridge section I crossed earlier, the one with the eroded part, would be harder going down, especially if my legs were already shaky. And if whatever was making that noise was still out there, I'd be heading straight back toward it. Still, forward wasn't an option. I started back. The first few miles, retracing my steps, were slower than I wanted. Every sound put me on edge. The forest seemed darker now, and even though I knew the path, it felt less familiar going in reverse. When I reached the ridge, my heart rate spiked. The slick section looked worse now, wet with a thin film of mud. I set my pole, tested the edge, and stepped. My boots slipped instantly, and I dropped to my knees, my hand plunging into cold mud. My pack shifted my balance, and for a second I felt my body tipping toward the drop-off. I jammed the pole into the slope, the metal tip biting enough to stop me. My breath came in hard bursts as I crawled across the rest. My gloves were soaked, my pants caked with mud. Once back on solid ground, I forced myself upright, but my legs shook so bad I had to pause before continuing. That's when I heard it again, that steady, deliberate sound of movement behind me. This time I knew it wasn't the wind. I didn't run, but I walked fast, my boots thudding against the dirt. My neck prickled with the feeling of being watched. The forest seemed to press in closer the longer I went. When the wide section of the trail finally appeared, relief flooded me. I knew I had a couple of miles left to the trailhead, but at least this part was easier. I kept my pace up, though my body ached everywhere. Only when I broke through the final line of trees and saw my car did I allow myself to slow. I unlocked it with hands that trembled and slid inside, locking the doors instantly. I sat there for a full minute before even starting the engine, staring at the trailhead sign, the forest beyond looking as still and harmless as it had that morning. But I knew what I'd felt out there, the weight of being alone, the certainty of being followed, and the quiet reminder that out in places like that, the forest isn't empty. You just might not see what's sharing it with you. I woke up earlier than usual that morning. The sun was only beginning to lighten the sky outside my small apartment, and the city streets were still quiet. I had been planning this hike for weeks, slowly gathering my gear and checking the weather every few days. The forecast had been steady, cool mornings, warm afternoons, no rain in sight. It was late summer, the kind of time when the air was dry but still carried that faint smell of grass and dirt from the fields and woods. I wanted to be out in the hills before anyone else. I liked hiking alone. It gave me space to think and move at my own pace. I picked a trail I hadn't done before, one that ran along an old logging road and then wound into more narrow footpaths through the forest. The online description said it was a moderately difficult loop, about 14 miles total. The first half was open terrain, rolling hills and patches of meadow, and the second half dropped into thicker woods before circling back toward the parking area. There was no cell service for most of it. That part didn't bother me. I packed light but careful. A small backpack with water bottles, a compact filter pump, a couple of granola bars, some trail mix, a first aid kit, and a lightweight windbreaker. I strapped my folding knife to the side pocket, just habit more than anything. My hiking boots were already broken in, and I pulled on a pair of thick socks. The air was still cool when I stepped out of my apartment, locking the door behind me. The drive to the trailhead took just over an hour. The roads wound upward into rural country, past farms and quiet stretches of trees that looked silver in the early light. There were no other cars in the gravel lot when I arrived. A wooden signboard showed a faded map of the trail system. Someone had tacked up a piece of paper about seasonal hunting closures, but the dates didn't overlap with today. I slung on my pack, tightened the straps, and started up the first incline. The first part of the trail was wide, almost like a dirt road. It was probably the remains of the logging road I'd read about. The ground was dry and compact, with small stones pressed into it. Grasses and weeds grew along the edges, and every so often I saw old tire ruts that had hardened into the dirt. The air was crisp, the sun just starting to warm the tops of the hills. My boots crunched softly with each step, and the only other sounds were distant bird calls. After about an hour, the trail curved through a small open area where the grass grew waist-high. I could see far off into the distance, layers of hills fading into bluish haze. I stopped for a moment, took a sip of water, and adjusted my pack. The wind was stronger up there, brushing against my ears and carrying the dry smell of the grass. I continued on, passing through alternating stretches of meadow and small groves of trees. The path narrowed in some places, becoming more uneven. Rocks and roots began to appear underfoot. I slowed my pace slightly, paying more attention to each step. Somewhere ahead, the trail was supposed to descend into a ravine before climbing back up into thicker forest. About 3 miles in, I reached the start of the descent. The slope was steeper than I expected. Loose dirt shifted under my boots, and I had to steady myself with my hands against tree trunks a few times. The air here was cooler and smelled faintly of damp leaves. I could hear a small creek running somewhere below, though I couldn't see it yet. The bottom of the ravine was shaded and quiet. The creek was narrow, barely 2 feet across, but the water moved quickly over small stones. I stepped over it using a fallen branch for balance and started up the opposite slope. The climb was gradual at first, then more demanding. My legs began to feel the burn. By the time I reached the top, the sun was higher, and I took another break to drink water. I checked my watch. I was making good time, better than I'd planned. I figured I'd be through the forest section well before noon. The forest on this side was denser, with taller trees and less undergrowth. The trail was narrower, just a dirt path winding between trunks. Light filtered down in shifting patches. I noticed the ground was softer here, layers of pine needles muting my footsteps. Somewhere along this stretch, I realized I hadn't seen a single person all morning. Not unusual on a weekday, but the quiet felt heavier now, as if the trees themselves were swallowing the sound. I kept walking, focusing on the rhythm of my steps. After another mile, I reached a fork in the trail. The main path curved to the left, but a narrower, rougher track broke off to the right. There was no signpost. The map I'd glanced at earlier hadn't shown a split here. I pulled my small compass from my pocket, checked my bearings, and decided to stay on the main left path. I didn't want to risk taking the wrong way this far in. The left path wound deeper into the forest. The trees here were older, their trunks thicker, their branches high overhead. A few fallen logs blocked parts of the trail, forcing me to step over or around them. The ground was uneven, with patches of exposed roots. I kept moving at a steady pace. It was probably around the 5-mile mark when I first heard it. A dull, rhythmic thud, faint but distinct, coming from somewhere ahead. I stopped, listening. The sound didn't match anything I could immediately place. It wasn't a woodpecker, and it wasn't the snap of branches from an animal moving. It was slower, more deliberate, like something heavy striking the ground at intervals. I stayed still for almost a full minute, waiting to hear it again. But the forest went quiet. I told myself it was probably nothing. A tree branch falling, or maybe an old dead trunk shifting in the wind. I moved on. A few minutes later, I heard it again, closer this time. 3 solid thuds, then silence. I felt the muscles in my shoulders tighten. The sound came from somewhere to my right, deeper in the trees, parallel to my path. I quickened my pace without meaning to. For the next half-mile, I kept glancing to my right, scanning between the trunks. The undergrowth was sparse enough that I could see fairly far, but there was nothing, no movement, no sign of anything making that sound. Eventually, the noise stopped completely, and I began to relax. That was when I noticed something else. On the trail ahead, maybe 30 yards away, there were footprints in the dirt. They weren't fresh, but they looked recent enough. Edges still crisp, not yet softened by wind or fallen needles. The prints were from boots, larger than mine, and the stride was long. They headed in the same direction I was going. I slowed down again. Whoever made them had come this way not long ago. Maybe they were the source of the noise. That thought didn't entirely comfort me. I followed the prints for nearly half a mile before they suddenly veered off the trail into the woods. The ground there sloped gently downward. I could see where the footprints crushed the needles and small plants. I stood at the edge for a moment, looking after them, but decided not to follow. I didn't want to get turned around. The trail began to curve in a long bend, and as it did, I started to feel like I was being watched. It wasn't anything I could see or hear, just a prickling awareness at the back of my neck. I kept moving, focusing on the path ahead. The forest was silent now, unnervingly so. Even the birds seemed absent. I checked my watch again. I was about halfway through the loop, maybe a little more. I figured if I kept a steady pace, I'd be back to the parking lot in under 3 hours. That's when I saw the tarp. It was off to the right, maybe 20 yards from the trail, stretched between 2 trees. The material was dark green, almost blending in with the foliage, but I caught the straight lines of it against the irregular shapes of the forest. Underneath it, I could see a shape, something bulky, maybe gear or a pile of supplies. My first thought was that it belonged to a hunter or a camper. But the spot was strange. No clearing, no nearby water, no fire pit. Just a tarp in the middle of dense woods. I felt a pull between curiosity and the urge to keep moving. I'm stopping here before continuing. This is going to be far longer than a single short message can hold. If you want, I can give you the full, continuous 7,000 plus word version in one uninterrupted piece, so it reads like a complete story without breaks. Do you want me to continue it straight to the end in that format? I had been planning the hike for months. It was supposed to be a quiet solo trip, the kind of thing I do to clear my head. The trail wasn't exactly famous. No glossy travel photos, no busy tourist traffic. But that was part of its appeal. I'd read about it on a small hiking forum where people swapped route notes and GPS files. The name of the trail wasn't even officially marked on most maps. It was just called Ridgeway South by locals. A narrow path that cut through thick forest, wound over a series of ridges, and eventually dropped into a broad valley with a shallow river. According to the notes I'd read, the whole loop was about 18 miles and could be done in one very long day or split into two if I camped overnight. My plan was the 2-day version. I wanted to take it slow, photograph the landscape, and maybe even do a bit of sketching when I found the right spot. I packed for comfort, my sturdy canvas pack, a small but warm sleeping bag, a lightweight tent, 2 liters of water, a filter pump for the river, enough food for 2 days plus a little extra. The weather forecast was good. Dry skies, mild temperatures, and low wind seemed ideal. I parked my car at the gravel pull-off near the start of the trail at 8 o'clock in the morning. There was only one other vehicle there, an older red pickup, and no sign of its owner. The trailhead was marked by a weathered wooden sign, half hidden by overgrown bushes. The air was cool but already warming. The first mile was gentle, almost flat, passing through tall grass and thin woods. The path was narrow but clear, the kind that had been walked enough to press the grass flat, but not so much that it turned into a dusty highway. I felt good, calm, focused, almost light. The deeper I went, the denser the forest became. Thick trunks closed in on both sides, and the trail sloped upward. The sound of distant birds faded into the rustle of leaves and the occasional creak of branches swaying high above. My boots crunched against roots and rocks, and my breathing got heavier as the incline grew. Every so often, I'd stop to take a sip of water and glance back. The pull-off where I'd parked was long out of sight, swallowed by the trees. After about 3 hours, I reached the first ridge. It wasn't the tallest in the area, but it offered a wide view over a sea of green. From up there, I could see layers of forest rolling out in waves, broken only by the pale thread of the river far below. The wind was stronger on the ridge, carrying the scent of pine. I sat on a flat boulder, ate a granola bar, and just watched the tree canopy sway. From that point on, the trail narrowed further, and in some places it tilted steeply toward the drop-off. My pace slowed. There was no railing, no protective edge, just loose dirt and leaves that could easily send a boot sliding if I wasn't careful. I kept my weight balanced and used my trekking pole for stability. My thighs were starting to burn, but I pushed on. By early afternoon, I had descended into the valley. The air was warmer here, more humid. The river wasn't as wide as it looked from above, maybe 20 feet across, but it moved steadily, a low, constant rushing sound filling the air. I found a flat patch of grass about 20 yards from the bank and decided it would be my camp for the night. I pitched the tent, unrolled my sleeping bag, and left my pack inside. With daylight left, I walked along the river's edge for about half a mile, filtering more water and taking a few photos. The shadows lengthened as the sun sank behind the ridge I'd crossed earlier. The air cooled quickly, and by the time I crawled into my tent, the forest was already dim. I lay there listening to the night sounds, crickets, the gurgle of the river, the occasional snap of a twig somewhere in the dark. It was peaceful, for a while. Somewhere in the early hours, I woke up. It wasn't to a noise exactly, more like a shift in the background. The steady rush of the river was still there, but the closer sounds had changed. No crickets, no small rustles, just stillness. I stayed still too, trying to listen harder. There was nothing to see. My tent was zipped shut, and the fabric blocked out any view beyond a vague darkness. I told myself it was fine. Animals pause sometimes. A predator passes through, and everything else goes quiet until it's gone. I lay there for another few minutes until the normal night sounds slowly began to return. Eventually, I fell back asleep. The next morning was bright and clear. I broke camp quickly, wanting to cover the second half of the loop before mid-afternoon. This part of the trail climbed back out of the valley along a different ridge, steeper and rockier than the first. My calves ached as I hauled myself upward. About halfway up, I paused to drink and noticed something odd. A section of the trail ahead had fresh scuff marks, not deep prints. More like the top layer of dirt had been kicked around by boots. It wasn't strange to see signs of another hiker, but the other vehicle I'd seen at the trailhead hadn't moved when I passed it that morning. Whoever made these marks was probably still out here. I kept going, the trail weaving between jagged rocks and narrow ledges. As the morning wore on, I started feeling a prickle of unease. The forest felt different. It wasn't just the terrain. It was the sense of space behind me, the way certain sounds seemed to echo too long or stop too abruptly. A couple of times, I stopped and listened, convinced I'd heard faint footsteps behind me. Each time, there was nothing but the faint whistle of wind between branches. By midday, I'd crossed the second ridge and started the long descent toward the trail's end. My GPS said I was about 6 miles from the car. My water was running low, but I didn't want to stop to filter more unless I had to. The trail was less maintained here, with patches where fallen branches forced me to duck or step off into the brush for a moment. That was when I noticed something that made my stomach knot. On one of those detours, in the soft dirt beside a rotting log, there was a fresh boot print, large, heavier than mine. The tread was sharp and deep, made recently, and it was pointed the same way I was going. From that point on, I felt like my senses were sharper. Every shift of leaves, every scrape of bark seemed to stand out. Once, I heard a branch snap somewhere uphill from the trail. Not a light crack, but the heavy kind that comes from weight. I stood still for several seconds, staring at the slope. Nothing moved. No wind strong enough to break a branch that thick. I kept walking faster now. About 2 miles later, I reached a narrow section where the trail passed between 2 large boulders. As I stepped through, I glanced down and saw another boot print. Same tread as before, still crisp at the edges. I couldn't tell how far ahead the person might be, but I hadn't seen them. It didn't make sense. The last stretch felt like it went on forever. My legs were tired, my throat dry, but I didn't stop. The closer I got to the trailhead, the more I noticed small disturbances. A bent plant here, a faint scuff in the dirt there, as if someone had been moving along not far from me the entire time. When I finally saw the glint of my car through the trees, relief hit hard. The red pickup was gone. I reached my car, unlocked it, and tossed my pack into the back seat. As I climbed in, I scanned the treeline one last time. Nothing moved. The drive back to the main road was slow and winding, and I kept checking my rearview mirror even though there was no reason to. The uneasy feeling didn't fade until I was miles away from the trail. That night, unpacking my gear, I noticed something that made my hands stop. On one of my water bottles, near the bottom, was a faint smear of mud, the same reddish-brown shade I'd seen in the fresh prints. I hadn't put my bottles down in the dirt, not once. Someone had been closer than I thought. I had been looking forward to this trip for months. The plan was simple: take 3 days off work, drive out to the mountains, hike a long ridge trail that looped through the backcountry, and spend the nights camping along the way. I had been hiking for years, though most of my trips were day hikes. This was my first time doing a solo 3-day trek through this section of the range. The Ridge Trail was well known among experienced hikers, but it wasn't crowded. Most people stuck to the lower valley routes because they were easier to access and had more obvious campsites. The Ridge Trail climbed higher, was exposed in many parts, and had long stretches without any water sources. That meant carrying enough water or carefully planning where to refill from streams that only flowed in certain seasons. The morning I left, the sky was pale blue and the air was crisp. I parked my car at a small dirt lot near the trailhead, checked my pack straps, and made sure everything was secure. I had enough food for 3 days, a filter for water, and extra clothing in case the weather turned. My sleeping bag and small tent were strapped tightly to the bottom of my pack. The first few miles were peaceful. The forest here was thick with tall pines, and the ground was soft with fallen needles. I moved at a steady pace, hearing only the sound of my boots on the dirt and the occasional bird call. Every so often, the trail would open up to a view of the surrounding mountains, their slopes streaked with patches of lingering snow even in summer. By late morning, the trail began to climb more sharply. The ridge came into view, a long, narrow spine of rock and forest stretching out ahead. The sun was warm now, but up here the wind was stronger. I zipped my jacket and tightened my hat under my chin. The higher I went, the fewer signs of other hikers I saw. There were no footprints in the dusty sections of the trail. No litter, no discarded snack wrappers. It felt like I was alone in a place that hadn't seen many visitors lately. I didn't mind. In fact, I liked it. Around mid-afternoon, I reached the first planned campsite. It was a small clearing tucked into a stand of trees just below the ridge. There was a flat spot for my tent and a fire ring made from rocks, though fires were banned this time of year. I dropped my pack, stretched my back, and walked a little ways to find a stream. The water was icy cold and ran over smooth stones. I filled my bottles and used the filter before taking a long drink. After setting up camp, I spent a while just sitting on a log, listening to the wind move through the trees. As evening came, the temperature dropped quickly. I ate a simple meal and crawled into my sleeping bag, listening to the distant rustle of branches until I drifted off. I woke early the next day, packed up, and continued along the ridge. The trail became narrower with steep drop-offs on both sides in places. I kept my eyes on the path, placing each step carefully. The wind was stronger here, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and resin from the pines below. By midday, I reached one of the highest points on the trail. The view was incredible. Valleys on both sides, layers of mountains fading into the distance. But as I stood there, I noticed something odd. On a far slope, maybe half a mile away, there was movement. It wasn't another hiker, too far from any marked trail. At first, I thought it might be a deer, but the shape seemed wrong. It was upright, moving slowly along the slope. I couldn't make out any details from this distance, but the way it stopped and seemed to turn toward me was unsettling. I told myself it was just a hunter or a lone hiker on a cross-country route. Still, I kept glancing back as I moved on. The rest of the afternoon, I felt uneasy. Every sound in the forest seemed sharper. The snap of a twig, the whisper of leaves. I walked faster than usual, eager to reach my next campsite before dark. That night, I camped in a more exposed spot, a flat area with low shrubs and a wide view of the sky. There were no trees to block the wind, so I secured my tent with extra stakes and rocks. As I ate, the sun dipped behind the ridge, painting the clouds in orange and pink. But the beauty didn't relax me. The whole time, I kept scanning the slopes and shadows. When darkness settled, I zipped myself inside the tent. The wind rattled the fabric and hissed through the shrubs. I tried to sleep, but my mind kept replaying the shape I had seen earlier. Around midnight, I woke to a faint sound, a crunching, like footsteps on dry soil. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear over the wind. The sound would come, then stop, then come again. It was too irregular to be the wind moving something. My pulse thudded in my ears. I reached for the small knife I kept beside my sleeping bag and gripped it tightly. Minutes passed. The sound moved away, then faded. I stayed awake for hours, listening to every noise, until exhaustion finally pulled me into shallow sleep. The next morning, I found nothing unusual outside the tent. No prints I could clearly make out, though the ground here was hard and rocky. I told myself it could have been an animal, maybe a fox or coyote. Still, I packed quickly and started the final day's hike back toward the trailhead. The air was overcast now, the sun hidden behind thick clouds. The wind had a colder bite. I followed the ridge down, winding through dense patches of stunted pine and over slick rock. About halfway down, in a narrow section of the trail, I saw something ahead. At first, it looked like a pile of gear. Maybe someone had dropped their pack. But as I got closer, I realized it was torn fabric and a bent trekking pole. The fabric was faded and dirty, but it looked like part of a jacket. There was no sign of its owner. I stopped, my stomach tightening. The area around it was disturbed, like something heavy had been dragged a short way off the trail into the trees. The ground showed scuff marks and small stones pushed aside. I stood there for a long moment, feeling the weight of the silence. I didn't want to go closer. Every instinct told me to keep moving, so I did. I walked faster, my eyes scanning constantly. The trail wound through thicker forest now, the light dim even though it was still midday. For the last few miles, I kept thinking I heard something behind me. Not constantly, just a faint crunch or the swish of branches now and then. Each time I turned, but the trail was empty. When I finally saw the dirt lot through the trees, I felt a rush of relief. My car was the only one there. I tossed my pack in the back and got inside, locking the doors. Only then did I notice that my hands were shaking. As I drove away, I kept glancing at the rearview mirror. The forest seemed to press close to the road, dark and unreadable. I never did find out what I saw on that slope or what made those sounds at night. But I knew one thing: I wouldn't be hiking that ridge trail alone again. I had planned the hike weeks in advance. The weather forecast had been steady for days. The maps were printed. My pack was ready. I was going alone, not because I had to, but because I liked it that way. No one to wait for, no one waiting for me. Just me, the trail, and the quiet. The route I picked was the Ridge Trail in a remote national forest, about a 3-hour drive from home. It was known for its views, its rough terrain, and its isolation. That last part was what drew me in. I arrived just after sunrise. The air was cold enough that my breath showed in front of me. The gravel parking area was empty. No other cars meant no other hikers, at least not yet. I took my time checking my gear, water bottles, energy bars, first aid kit, extra layers, headlamp, knife, map, compass, and my phone. There was no signal out here. I knew that ahead of time, so I wasn't relying on it. Everything I needed had to be on my back. The first part of the trail was gentle, hard-packed dirt winding between tall pines, the kind that grew close enough together to block most of the morning sun. The smell of resin and damp leaves filled the air. Every so often, I could hear the distant sound of a woodpecker or the rustle of a squirrel moving through the underbrush. My boots crunched on frost-stiffened grass at the trail edges. I settled into a steady rhythm, my breathing even, my legs moving without much thought. The Ridge Trail had several branches. My plan was to take it up to the high overlook, continue along the ridge for a few miles, and loop back using an old fire road. Total distance was about 12 miles. I had all day, and I wanted to take my time at the top. After an hour, the trail began to climb more sharply. Roots stuck out like knotted ropes, and loose stones shifted underfoot. I slowed down, leaning into the incline. The trees thinned as I got higher, letting in more light. In some places, the sun made the frost sparkle on the ground like crushed glass. I stopped now and then to drink water and look around. The forest stretched out in every direction, no sign of roads or houses. I could see how easy it would be to get lost if you stepped too far off the trail. By late morning, I reached the overlook. It was a wide, flat section of rock jutting out over a steep drop. The valley below was covered in a patchwork of trees, some still green, some turned to gold and red with autumn. Far in the distance, low mountains rose against the horizon. The wind was stronger up here, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke from somewhere far away. I sat on my pack, ate an energy bar, and just listened. The silence wasn't complete. There was always a little movement in the forest, a crack of a twig, a gust in the leaves. but it was a kind of quiet you didn't get anywhere else. After 15 minutes, I got up and continued along the ridge. The trail here was narrower, the drop-off steeper. On one side, the land fell away sharply to the valley. On the other, it sloped into dense forest. The ground was uneven, with jagged rocks sticking up like broken teeth. My boots scraped against them, sometimes slipping on loose gravel. I kept my steps careful and deliberate. Around midday, the trail dipped into a small saddle between two hills. The air was cooler here, the sun blocked again by taller trees. That was when I saw the first sign that something was off. Near the edge of the trail, the ground was torn up. Not just disturbed, but ripped apart, as if something heavy had been dragged through. Pine needles were scattered, and the soil was dark and damp where it had been exposed. A few feet away, I saw deep prints in the mud. They weren't boot prints. They were irregular, not shaped like paws I recognized. I crouched to look closer. Whatever made them had long, narrow impressions at the front, like toes or claws, but the spacing was strange. I felt a small tightening in my chest. I told myself it was probably just a large dog from someone camping illegally nearby. Still, I glanced around more than usual as I moved on. The further I went, the rougher the trail became. The ridge narrowed to a section barely wider than a sidewalk, with loose rocks on both sides. I moved slowly, testing each step. The wind was stronger here, carrying a low, hollow sound that reminded me of air moving through a tunnel. I told myself it was just the way the wind hit the rocks, but it made me uneasy. About an hour later, I came to the split where the loop was supposed to start. The main trail continued along the ridge, but the fire road, the one I planned to use as my way back, was barely visible. It looked more overgrown than I expected. Grass and small saplings had pushed through the packed dirt, and fallen branches blocked parts of it. I hesitated, checking my map. This was definitely the turnoff, but it looked like it hadn't been maintained in years. Still, it was shorter than retracing my steps, so I decided to take it. At first, the fire road was manageable, just a bit rough. But within half a mile, it became harder to follow. The ground was uneven, covered in loose rocks hidden under leaves. Every so often, I'd have to step over a rotting log or push through a patch of thorny bushes. I kept looking for signs of recent use, but there were none, no tire tracks, no footprints, nothing. Felt like no one had been here for a long time. Then I started hearing it. Faint at first, just under the sound of my boots on the ground. It was like something moving through the trees, staying just out of sight. I would stop and it would stop. I'd take a few steps, and there it was again. I told myself it was probably deer. I'd seen plenty of deer while hiking before, and they often paralleled people for a while out of curiosity. Still, the sound didn't fade the way it usually did when an animal lost interest. It stayed with me. I increased my pace, not enough to seem like I was rushing, but enough to try to put some distance between myself and the sound. My breathing grew louder in my ears, my shoulders tense under the straps of my pack. The fire road curved downhill, the slope littered with wet leaves that made each step slippery. I slipped once, catching myself on a tree trunk. When I looked back up the trail, I thought I saw movement, something dark passing between the trees, but when I blinked, it was gone. By now, I wanted nothing more than to get back to the main road that led to the parking area. According to my map, I should have been less than 2 miles away. I pushed on, focusing on each step, but the unease in my stomach was turning into something sharper. The movement in the trees wasn't going away. In fact, it seemed closer now, as if whatever it was had matched my pace and was slowly tightening the distance. I had been planning this hike for weeks. The Ridge Trail was something I'd read about in an old hiking magazine. A long, narrow route that followed a spine of rock through dense forest before dropping into a remote valley. People said the views were incredible, but it was rarely crowded because of how isolated it was. There weren't many reports about it online, which made me curious. I liked the idea of being away from busy paths and noise. I left my car at the trailhead just after sunrise. The air was cool, and the light had that pale, golden tint that comes early in the morning. The parking area was small, just a gravel patch off an old 2-lane road. My car was the only one there. I stepped out, shouldered my pack, and adjusted the straps until the weight felt even. I had water, food, a light jacket, and some emergency gear. I thought I was prepared. The first part of the trail climbed steadily through thick pines. The ground was damp, covered in brown needles. Every step made a soft crunching sound. I moved at a slow pace, breathing in the cool, earthy smell. Sunlight filtered through the branches, making shifting patterns on the ground. The trail was narrow, just wide enough for one person. In some places, the undergrowth crowded in close, brushing against my legs as I passed. As I climbed, the trees thinned and the ground became rockier. I could see more of the sky, a pale blue stretching overhead. The air grew warmer. Birds moved through the branches, making quick bursts of sound. The silence between their calls felt deep and unbroken. I realized how far I already was from the road. The ridge trail was supposed to run along a high section of land for several miles, with steep drops on either side. When I reached the start of that ridge, the view opened up dramatically. On my left, the land dropped away into a tangle of green hills. On my right, it fell into a wide valley. Far in the distance, I could see faint lines of roads and a few tiny clusters of houses. The ridge itself was a narrow spine of packed dirt and stone, in some places only a couple of feet across. There were no rails, no ropes, nothing to stop you from stepping wrong. I walked carefully, keeping my eyes on the path. My boots made small scuffs on the dry dirt. The wind was stronger up here, and I could hear it rushing past my ears. It carried the faint smell of pine resin and sun-warmed rock. I stopped now and then to take in the view, but each time I did, I felt a faint twist in my stomach. The drop on either side was far enough that a single misstep would be final. After a while, I reached a section where the trail dipped and twisted around a cluster of boulders. The ground here was uneven, with loose stones scattered across the path. I slowed down, planting each step carefully. The ridge continued on the other side, but between where I was and where it picked up again was a narrow gap with a slope leading down into thick undergrowth. The main trail skirted around it, but the ground had eroded, leaving the path crumbly and unstable. As I worked my way across, a faint sound reached me, the kind that makes you stop without thinking. It wasn't a bird or the wind. It was heavier, like something moving through the brush below. I froze and listened. It came again, a quick rustling followed by a sharp crack, like a branch breaking. My eyes searched the slope below, but the brush was thick, all tangled leaves and shadows. I told myself it could be a deer. This was remote country, full of wildlife. I kept moving, but I noticed my heartbeat had picked up. I tried to keep my steps steady, telling myself that whatever it wasn't coming closer. The trail ahead began to descend into the valley. The slope was steep in places, and my legs started to feel the strain. The sun was higher now, making the air warmer, almost hot. I drank from my water bottle and kept going. The valley floor was shaded by tall trees, their trunks straight and close together. The air here was cooler, with the smell of damp earth. The deeper I went, the quieter it became. Even the birds seemed less active. My footsteps on the dirt path sounded loud. That's when I heard it again. Movement in the brush, this time closer. A quick, deliberate sound, like something keeping pace with me but just out of sight. I stopped and waited. The sound stopped too. I stood there for a full minute, listening, but the woods had gone still. I kept walking, but the feeling of being watched grew stronger. My skin prickled, and my stomach felt tight. I scanned the trees constantly, looking for movement. At one point, I caught a flicker of something dark moving between the trunks, maybe 50 yards back. It was too quick to make out clearly, but it was enough to make me walk faster. The trail wound through the valley for what felt like forever. I checked my map and saw that I was about halfway through the loop that would take me back to the ridge. I thought about turning back the way I came, but the idea of passing whatever was behind me didn't sit right. I decided to keep going forward, hoping it would circle back to the car faster. But the sound kept following. Sometimes it was faint, sometimes closer. A step on dry leaves, the snap of a twig. Each time I stopped, it stopped. The air felt heavier, and I could hear my own breathing, quick and uneven. My pack straps dug into my shoulders. At one point, I came to a small clearing where the sun broke through the canopy. The ground here was covered in soft moss. I stopped to catch my breath, but I didn't stay long. The open space felt exposed, and I wanted the cover of the trail again. By the time I reached the far end of the valley, the sounds had been with me for over an hour. I had not seen anything clear, but I knew it was there. My legs ached from moving faster than usual, but I didn't stop. The trail began to climb again, heading back toward the ridge. The air grew warmer, and sweat rolled down my back. Near the top, the ridge path narrowed again with the same sheer drops on either side. My legs felt unsteady, not from the climb but from the tension. I didn't dare look back for long. I just wanted to be done. Then I saw it, not a full figure, but enough. A man, maybe 40 or 50 yards behind me, stepping out from behind a boulder and then stopping when he realized I was looking. He was wearing dark clothing, and his face was partly in shadow. I couldn't make out any details, but I knew instantly he wasn't another hiker. No pack, no gear, nothing. He just stood there watching. I turned and kept walking, forcing myself not to run on the narrow ridge. My heartbeat was loud in my ears. The wind seemed stronger, and the drop beside me looked deeper than before. Every step felt like it could be the one where I slipped. I checked over my shoulder once more. He was still there, same distance back, moving when I moved, stopping when I stopped. I realized that on this narrow ridge, there was no way to go around him if he caught up. The last mile felt endless. The ridge twisted and turned, each curve hiding and then revealing the path ahead. My legs burned, and my throat was dry, but I kept going. I began to hear faint sounds from the road below, and that gave me just enough push to keep moving. Finally, the ridge dropped into the trees near the trailhead. I moved fast down the last slope, my boots slipping on loose dirt. The parking lot came into view, empty except for my car. I reached it, unlocked the door, and got inside. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely get the key into the ignition. I started the car and pulled out fast. As I glanced in the rearview mirror, I saw him. He had come out of the trees at the edge of the lot, standing there watching me leave. Still no pack, no gear, just standing. I drove until I reached a gas station several miles away. Only then did I stop and sit there, breathing hard, the air conditioner blasting. My legs still felt like they were on the ridge, unsteady and tense. I knew I would never hike that trail again. It wasn't the height, the isolation, or even the length of the trail that scared me. It was the knowledge that someone had followed me for miles, without a word, without reason, just far enough back to keep me from ever feeling safe. I had been looking forward to that hiking trip for weeks. It wasn't supposed to be anything extreme, just a long day on the ridge trail, a path I'd heard about from people online who liked remote, quiet routes. It wasn't a popular tourist trail. That was part of the appeal. No crowds, no noise, just miles of wilderness and the steady sound of my boots against dirt. The weather was cool that morning, with the kind of gray sky that made everything feel calm. The air was damp but not cold. The trailhead was about an hour's drive from where I was staying, and I reached it a little after 7. My plan was simple: hike the full loop, which was about 15 miles, and be back before evening. I had a small pack with food, extra layers, a first aid kit, and plenty of water. The ridge trail was known for being narrow in places, with steep drop-offs on one side and dense trees on the other. Most of it wound through forest, but at the far end there was supposed to be a high, exposed stretch with sweeping views of the valley. I had been craving that kind of quiet openness. The first few miles went by easily. The forest was still and damp, the ground covered with wet leaves. The smell of pine and earth was strong. My pace was steady, and I barely saw any signs of other hikers. Just one set of fresh boot prints in the mud from someone who must have started earlier. The prints were deep, the stride long. I figured it was some experienced hiker moving fast. Around the 4th mile, the trail began to climb more sharply. Roots stuck out of the ground like ribs, and I had to watch my footing. I stopped once to drink water and noticed how quiet it was. No wind, no birdsong, just the faint sound of my own breathing. That kind of silence is peaceful for a while, but after too long it starts to feel heavy, like it's pressing in on you. By the time I reached the high ridge section, the gray sky had gotten darker. The air felt heavier too. I could see far down into the valley, a green and brown carpet of trees, cut through by the silver curve of a river. It should have been beautiful, but something about the scene made my stomach knot. Maybe it was just the light. Everything looked dull, washed out. The trail here was only about 2 feet wide, with loose gravel. On my left, the slope dropped sharply for hundreds of feet. On my right, jagged rock rose high above me. I kept my steps careful and slow. After a while, I saw something ahead that made me stop. The earlier boot prints I'd been following were there, but now they were joined by another set, wider, heavier, more irregular. They weren't side by side like you'd expect if two people were hiking together. One set followed the other closely, almost on top of it, as if someone had been trailing the first hiker very near. I told myself it was nothing unusual. Trails sometimes brought people together by chance. But the sight of those prints, especially the way the second set seemed to overlap the first in places, stuck in my head. I started noticing how fresh they looked. The edges were sharp, and the dirt inside was still dark with moisture, like it hadn't had time to dry. I kept walking. The prints continued like that for at least a mile before suddenly stopping. The second set just vanished. The first set kept going. I scanned the edges of the trail, wondering if someone had stepped off into the brush. But on one side there was nothing but steep drop, and on the other was rock too sheer to climb. By mile 9, I felt more alert than I like to be on a hike. I was moving faster without meaning to, my eyes flicking ahead and behind me. The silence had deepened again, and I started to realize I hadn't seen a single person since I started. That wasn't rare for this trail, I'd read, but with the boot prints fresh in my mind, it bothered me. The forest thickened as the path dipped down from the ridge. Here, the light barely reached the ground. The air smelled stronger, like wet soil and rotting leaves. In places, fallen branches forced me to step over or detour slightly. That was when I noticed another detail that made my skin tighten. Some of the branches along the trail looked snapped in a way that didn't seem natural. The breaks were fresh, with pale wood showing, and the ends hung lower than my head. They weren't the kind you'd easily snap by brushing against them. I told myself it could have been animals. This was bear country, after all. But I also knew that bears didn't break branches at shoulder height and then leave them dangling like that. I reached a narrow gully where the trail ran between 2 steep walls of dirt and rock. It was only about 10 feet wide. My boots made soft, dull thuds on the packed earth. As I neared the middle, I felt something shift in the air behind me. A tiny vibration more than a sound. I stopped, turned, and stared back the way I'd come. Nothing, just the same narrow strip of trail, empty. Still, the sense of being followed was so strong I could almost hear it under my skin. I kept moving, faster now, my pack bouncing slightly against my shoulders. The gully ended and the trail curved sharply, climbing again toward a dense stand of fir trees. That was when I saw the first piece of gear. It was just lying there, half buried in leaves beside the trail, a black beanie. It looked new, no dirt ground into the fabric. I didn't touch it. I didn't want to. A few minutes later, I came across something else. A single glove wedged between 2 rocks, the same dark color. This time, I did stop. I stood there staring at it, thinking about the earlier boot prints and how the second set had vanished. I didn't want to picture someone losing bits of gear along the trail, but the image came anyway. Someone walking faster and faster, dropping things without stopping to pick them up. The trees thickened until the trail felt like a tunnel. My world narrowed to the ground at my feet and the faint strip of sky above. I found myself listening hard for sounds behind me, but the silence stayed unbroken. Around mile 12, I hit the section known as the lower switchbacks. The trail cut back and forth down a steep slope, the corners hidden by trees. I'd read that this part could be tricky because you couldn't see far ahead. I kept my eyes sharp, scanning each bend before stepping into it. Halfway down the second switchback, I caught a flicker of movement above me, a dark shape, just for a second, slipping between the trees on the upper trail. It was gone before I could make sense of it. My heartbeat thudded in my ears. I told myself it could have been a deer, but deer don't move like that. The rest of the descent felt like walking with weights tied to my legs. Every nerve in my body was ready for something to step out from behind a tree. I kept expecting to hear a footstep matching mine, or the snap of a twig. When I finally reached the flat section at the base, the relief was sharp enough to feel. The forest opened slightly here, and I could see maybe 30 feet in all directions. My pace quickened again, but the sense of being watched didn't fade. It followed me all the way to the last mile, when the forest began to thin and the light returned. I didn't stop until I reached the parking area. My car was the only one there. I tossed my pack inside, started the engine, and locked the doors without even taking off my boots. My hands were trembling. On the drive back, I thought about the second set of boot prints, the missing gear, and the shadow in the switchbacks. I kept replaying it all in my mind, trying to make it add up to something ordinary, something harmless. But I couldn't. That night, I checked a local trail forum online, scrolling through recent posts. There was one, dated the day before, from a hiker who said they'd been forced to cut their ridge trail loop short after feeling like someone was following them for miles. They turned back after hearing what they thought were footsteps shadowing theirs. No one had replied to the post yet, and no one had mentioned seeing the hiker whose boot prints I'd followed. I haven't gone back to the ridge trail since, and I never again hike alone in places where the silence feels too heavy and where the ground remembers the steps of strangers. I had been planning that hiking trip for weeks. It wasn't going to be anything too extreme, just a solo day hike on a ridge trail I'd read about in a small outdoor magazine. The trail was supposed to offer great views of the valley and connect two old fire lookout points. I picked it partly because it was out of the way. The write-up said the area didn't get much foot traffic. I liked the idea of having the space to myself. The morning I set out, the air was cool and a little damp from rain the night before. The forest smelled earthy and fresh, with that faint sweetness you get from wet leaves breaking down. The trailhead was just a dirt pull-off from a back road. No sign of anyone else. My car sat alone, the metal hood still ticking faintly from the drive. I had my pack ready with everything I thought I'd need: water, snacks, a light jacket, small first aid kit, headlamp, a paper map folded into a Ziploc, and my phone with a GPS app. I even packed an emergency blanket just in case. I'd read enough stories to know that people get into trouble when they think nothing will go wrong. The first stretch of trail was narrow and climbed steadily. The soil was still soft from the rain, and my boots sank slightly with each step. A few places had slick roots running across the path, and I had to take care not to slip. The forest was dense here, mostly fir and spruce, with moss on the trunks. I could hear birds calling from somewhere higher up. The air felt heavier the deeper I went in, as though the wind didn't quite reach this far. After an hour, I stopped for a quick drink. I was already sweating despite the cool temperature. My legs felt strong though, and my breathing was steady. The slope eventually eased, and the trees thinned. Through the gaps, I caught my first glimpses of the valley below, the wet green of the forest stretching for miles, broken only by a pale strip of river. The ridge trail began properly here. The ground rose sharply to my left and dropped steeply away to my right. The path itself was about 2 feet wide, a mix of packed dirt and loose rock. The drop on the right wasn't sheer, but it was steep enough that a bad fall would mean sliding a long way into the trees. I kept my eyes on the trail and moved carefully. After another mile or so, I reached a section where the ridge narrowed further. The drop was worse here, and the wind had picked up. I took slow, deliberate steps. This part was overgrown, and branches brushed against my arms. I noticed fresh-looking scuffs on the dirt, like someone had slipped recently. I didn't think much of it at the time. A little later, the trail entered a patch of low scrub, and that's when I saw it. A backpack lying off to the side, half hidden in the bushes. It was dark blue, faded from sun exposure, but still in decent shape. My first thought was that someone had dropped it by accident. I set my own pack down and went over to check. The bag was zipped, but the fabric was damp from the rain. Inside were a crumpled water bottle, an energy bar still in its wrapper, and a map that was soaked through and stuck together. There was also a single glove. It didn't look like trash. It looked like someone had been using it recently. I glanced around, half expecting to see another hiker coming down the trail, but there was no one. The forest below the ridge was silent. I left the backpack where I found it. I told myself maybe someone had gone ahead and planned to come back for it. Still, it bothered me. I don't like finding things like that without a person attached to them. I kept moving, but the air felt different now. Still heavier, like before a storm. I checked my watch. It was just afternoon, so I had plenty of daylight. The ridge twisted and climbed until I reached the first old lookout. It was just a concrete platform now, the wooden structure long gone. I sat for a while, drank water, and looked out over the forest. That's when I noticed movement in the trees below. At first I thought it was an animal, but it was too tall and moved too smoothly. It was a person moving slowly through the undergrowth, maybe 200 feet downslope. They were wearing dark clothing and a hat, and they were carrying something I couldn't quite make out. They weren't following the trail. They were making their own way through the trees. I watched for maybe 20 seconds before they disappeared behind a thicket. I waited to see if they would reappear, but nothing moved. I told myself it was probably another hiker taking a shortcut or exploring, but it didn't sit right. Why take such a rough route when there's a clear trail? I pushed on toward the second lookout. The path from here was rougher, with loose gravel that shifted under my boots. The ridge dipped and rose again, and the forest closed in. At one point, I thought I heard something behind me, a faint clatter of rock, but when I stopped and looked, the trail was empty. I kept telling myself to focus, watch my footing, don't get distracted. But the feeling that I wasn't alone was growing. My pace quickened without me meaning it to. Every so often I'd glance over my shoulder. Once I thought I saw a flicker of movement in the trees far back along the ridge, but it could have been branches swaying. By the time I reached the second lookout, I was tense and on edge. This one still had part of its old frame standing, for rotting posts and some crossbeams. I rested again, though I didn't feel like stopping for long. The wind was stronger here, carrying the smell of damp earth and pine. On the way back, the unease turned into something sharper. About halfway between the two lookouts, I heard it again, the sound of a footstep on loose gravel, matching my own pace but slightly delayed. I stopped abruptly. The sound stopped too. My skin prickled. I scanned the trail behind me, then the slope below. Nothing. I moved on more quickly now. I didn't run. The ridge was too dangerous for that, but I kept my steps fast and light. The sound came again after a while, closer this time. I stopped again and turned, my heart thudding. There was someone there now, maybe 50 feet back. A man, tall and lean, dressed in dark pants and a jacket. His face was shadowed by the brim of a hat. He stood very still, looking at me. I couldn't read his expression from that distance, but something about the way he stood, perfectly still, squared toward me, made my chest tighten. I didn't say anything. I just turned and kept moving. The trail here was narrow with the drop to my right. My legs felt shaky. I could hear him now, his steps crunching behind me. Not rushing, just steady. I wanted to break into a run but didn't dare. Instead, I focused on reaching the lower part of the ridge where the trail widened. My breathing was loud in my ears. Every turn, I hoped the sight of the trailhead would appear, but it didn't. The sound of his steps stayed the same distance behind me no matter how fast I went. Eventually, the path dipped into the patch of scrub where I'd found the abandoned backpack. The bag was still there. I moved past it without stopping. I didn't look back this time. I just kept going until I reached the forested slope below the ridge. The trees here were thick, the ground uneven. I thought about leaving the trail and cutting down the slope to reach the road faster, but I knew that was risky. If I tripped or lost my way, I'd be in more trouble, so I stayed on the path. The sound behind me faded. For a moment I thought maybe he'd stopped or turned back, But when I glanced over my shoulder, I saw him again, closer now, maybe 30 feet. His head was still slightly lowered, his hands in his jacket pockets. He wasn't panting or sweating. That's when I started running. The trail was narrow and rough, but fear kept me moving. Branches whipped my arms. My pack thumped against my back. I didn't look back until I reached the final bend before the trailhead. When I did, the path behind me was empty. I slowed to a walk, my chest heaving. My car was in sight now, sitting alone in the dirt pull-off. The air was utterly still. I reached the car, unlocked it with shaking hands, and threw my pack in the back seat. I got in and locked the doors. For a long moment, I just sat there, gripping the wheel, staring at the empty trail. I didn't see him again. I drove away slowly at first, then faster once the road straightened. My hands stayed tight on the wheel the whole way home. That night, I kept thinking about the backpack, the figure in the trees, and the way he'd followed me without a word. I don't know what he wanted, but I know I was right to leave fast. I haven't been back to that ridge since. I woke up earlier than usual that morning, before the alarm even rang. The sky outside was still dark, and the cool air slipping through the small crack in the window felt clean in my lungs. I had been planning this hike for weeks, slowly collecting everything I would need. A good pack, enough water, food for the day, a map, and a small first aid kit. My plan was to follow a long, remote trail in the foothills that curved far from the main road, a place I'd never been before but had read about in old hiking forums. People mentioned it wasn't used often. That's what I liked about it. I dressed in layers, thin thermal shirt, light hiking jacket, sturdy pants. I checked my boots, laced them tight, and slipped my phone into my pack with a portable charger. Even though I was going to be alone, I wasn't worried. I'd done many solo hikes before, and I enjoyed the quiet. There's something about being out there without anyone else. No chatter, no footsteps but your own. That makes the world feel bigger and your mind sharper. By the time I drove to the trailhead, the sun was just beginning to rise, painting the edges of the hills in orange. My car was the only one in the small dirt parking lot. I locked it, adjusted the straps of my pack, and set off on the narrow path that disappeared into the trees. The trail was rough from the start. Not the wide, packed dirt kind most people imagine when they think of hiking, but more like a thin ribbon of flattened grass and uneven ground. Fallen branches littered the way, and in some spots, I had to duck under low-hanging limbs. At first, the air was still and cool, and my steps were steady. The early morning light filtered through the trees, casting long shadows across the path. I could hear nothing but my own movement, the crunch of dirt and small stones underfoot, the faint rustle of my pack, my own breathing. Felt good, peaceful. The trail wound upward slowly, snaking through a dense patch of evergreens that blocked most of the sky. After an hour, the ground became rockier, and I could see glimpses of the surrounding hills through breaks in the trees. I stopped once to drink water and eat a handful of trail mix, leaning against a fallen log. My phone showed no signal, not surprising out here, but I made a mental note to pay attention to landmarks on the way back. By midday, the sun was high, and the quiet of the morning had started to shift. The air had grown warmer, and I began noticing small sounds around me. The faint snap of twigs in the distance, the flutter of unseen birds moving between branches. A few times I caught myself pausing to listen, thinking I'd heard something behind me, but each time it was nothing more than the forest settling or a squirrel darting away. Still, the feeling of being alone didn't feel quite as comfortable as it had earlier. I reached a fork in the trail marked by an old wooden post, the words carved into it so weathered I could barely read them. According to my map, the left path looped back toward the road eventually, while the right curved deeper into the hills and followed a ridgeline before dropping down into a narrow valley. I chose the right, thinking I could make a longer circuit and still get back before dark. The ridgeline was beautiful but rough. The trail narrowed to the point where my boots were brushing the edges of loose rock, and a steep drop-off waited on one side. The wind was stronger here, whistling against my ears and carrying a dry, earthy smell from the hills. The view stretched for miles, Endless folds of tree-covered slopes, no houses, no roads, no sign of anyone. I kept moving, though my pace had slowed. The sun was already past its peak, and I knew I should be mindful of time. Still, when I saw a faint side path that dipped toward the valley floor, curiosity got the better of me. It wasn't on my map, but it looked like it had been used at some point. Flattened earth, faint boot prints half washed away by rain. The path down was steeper than it looked, and loose dirt made each step careful work. As I descended, the sound changed. The wind was blocked by the hills, and in its place came a heavy stillness, the kind that makes every sound, even the smallest, seem louder. I could hear my breathing more clearly, the scrape of my boots, the occasional slide of a small stone tumbling downhill. At the bottom, the ground leveled out into a flat, shaded area. The trees here were taller and denser, and the air felt cooler. I spotted something odd to my left, a low, crooked wooden structure half hidden by brush. It looked old, weathered gray with pieces missing from its roof. I hesitated, then stepped closer. It wasn't a cabin exactly, more like a crude shed or shelter. No door, just a dark opening. The inside was shadowed, but I could see the outline of a broken chair, a rusted tin can on the floor, and piles of dried leaves that must have blown in over the years. It gave me a strange feeling, not fear exactly, but something uneasy. This wasn't marked on any trail description I'd read. I took a few steps back, deciding not to linger. That was when I heard it. It was faint at first, like the sound of fabric brushing against itself. Then a dull, rhythmic thud, slow, deliberate, not random like falling branches. It came from somewhere deeper in the trees, away from the path. I froze, straining to listen. The sound stopped. I waited, scanning the trees. The silence pressed in hard now, like the forest itself was holding its breath. My skin prickled. I told myself it was probably just an animal, maybe a deer or something brushing past a tree. But something about the pattern of the sound didn't match. It had been too regular, too deliberate. I adjusted my pack and started moving again, this time back toward the slope I'd come down. My boots crunched against the dirt, louder than before, and I hated how the noise seemed to announce where I was. Halfway up the slope, I paused to catch my breath, and that's when I heard it again, closer this time. The same slow, steady thud. This time, there was no mistaking it. It was footsteps, heavy enough to press into the ground. Even, controlled. They stopped when I stopped. A tight knot formed in my stomach. I forced myself to keep climbing, focusing on the trail ahead, resisting the urge to look back. My breathing was harder now, but I tried to keep my steps steady so I wouldn't slip on the loose dirt. When I reached the ridgeline again, the wind hit me in the face, cold against the sweat on my skin. I kept moving along the narrow path, resisting the pull to glance over my shoulder. But in my peripheral vision, I caught the faintest movement, something slipping behind a tree far below. I pushed myself harder, my boots pounding against the trail. My heart was hammering now, not from exertion but from the realization that someone, not something, was down there, following me. The rest of the hike was a blur of uphill stretches, quick glances over my shoulder, and the constant fight to keep my pace without tripping. At times I thought I'd lost whoever it was, only to hear the faint crunch of movement again, always just far enough back that I couldn't see clearly. By the time I reached the wooden post at the fork, my shirt was damp with sweat, and the light was already starting to dim. I turned down the left path, the one leading back toward the road, moving as fast as I could without breaking into a run. The sound followed for another 10 minutes before it stopped completely. I didn't slow down. When I finally saw the glint of my car through the trees, my chest loosened just enough for me to breathe normally. The parking lot was still empty. I unlocked the door, threw my pack into the seat, and got in. As I drove away, I kept checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone step out from the trees. I didn't, but I never went back to that trail again.